Here are the key messages for this update. The disturbance in the Western Gulf, it does have a well-defined low-level circulation. Right now, the winds with it are about 20 to 30 knots, but the convection and thunderstorms are disorganized around the center. So the Hurricane Center has not yet called it a tropical depression or anything like that. There is a still small window of time where it could intensify into a tropical depression or weak tropical storm, but this is unlikely as the center should make landfall around or a little after midnight tonight. The main impacts, again, some enhanced rainfall, sort of coming in batches and bands. And given how saturated the soils are, there is some flood threat from that. Some gusty winds and elevated tides also expected at the coast. And so we do have a coastal flood advisory for those areas. Can't rule out an isolated brief tornado in any of these rain bands, although it would be kind of an isolated occurrence. And right now the confidence is fairly high on the track and the impacts from this system, and we'll talk more about that later on. Here's a look at the latest satellite imagery. On the left-hand side, you can see that swirl in the Western Gulf, that low-level swirl. That is that circulation that we've been watching for the possibility of becoming a tropical depression or a weak tropical storm. But so far, it's still fairly disorganized. It's also moving over somewhat cooler water, actually along the Texas coast. And it's fairly sheared now. There's some dry air wrapped within it. So there's a lot of negatives to prevent it from intensifying. Still, given that it right now is initialized at about 30 knots, it wouldn't take much more to get up to tropical storm wind speeds. So there is an outside chance the Hurricane Center could decide to start issuing advisories on it as a tropical storm. But again, that's unlikely. There's a very small window now, just several hours before it makes landfall down near or just a little south of Matagorda Bay. On the lower right there, you see the latest radar image, or this is about 30 minutes old. You can see some areas of light to moderate rain pivoting across the area sort of from east to west. And this is kind of what we expect over the next day or so. Some batches of rain, some heavy downpours, brief heavy downpours, followed by breaks, and then some more rain. So we're not looking at a tremendous amount of additional rain, but where the heavy rain falls, we could get some at least street flooding and perhaps some other minor flooding since we've had such a lot of rain lately. The tropical weather outlook, when we briefed it this morning, I think the chance of development was 40%. That's been lifted to 60%. So it has a better than even chance, even in the small time remaining, of becoming a tropical depression or possibly a weak tropical storm. But again, there's not much time to go, and there are quite a few negative factors that are preventing it from intensifying. Here's a look at some estimated rainfall amounts. On the left-hand side, this is additional rainfall for tonight and Saturday. And on the right-hand side, additional rain Saturday night and Sunday. And you can see tonight and Saturday, we could see some areas of perhaps 1 to 2 inches of rain. We're looking mainly there at the dark green and yellow shaded zones, but that could almost be anywhere on the map as far as these locally higher amounts. And then Saturday night and Sunday, even lesser amounts, and these would be shifted more to the west, generally less than an inch when we get to Saturday night and Sunday. There is one caveat, and that is there is some hint in some of the models of a little bit of banding coming in on the backside off the Gulf. And so, that can always lead to some locally higher amounts. So we are still going to have to monitor the radar even through tomorrow for any kind of banding that could lead to locally higher amounts. There is no flash flood watch in effect right now for these amounts, which should be fairly manageable. But again, we have to keep an eye on the radar over the next 24 hours or so, especially. The flash flood risk maps here on the left-hand side, the greatest risk of flash flooding would be in that yellow area Lance showed this earlier. It was actually expanded a little bit further west today, given this one batch of rain coming through now. But again, for the most part, these rainfall amounts and rates should be manageable, but there is a risk in heavier downpours of leading to some additional flooding, especially given how saturated the soils are. And then Saturday night, you can see there is a marginal risk area for all but the northern areas. So even tomorrow, there could be some isolated locations of flash flooding. Again, want to refer to that possibility of some banding coming in off the Gulf. Not out of the question, even tomorrow, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. The severe weather threat today and tonight in the dark green area, can't rule out an isolated tornado, not looking at anything widespread, but that's what that darker green area indicates, a marginal risk of severe weather, perhaps an isolated tornado. And sort of the same thing for Saturday, although the chances tomorrow are even less than today of any kind of severe weather, either winds or isolated tornadoes. Marine hazards, this was brief this morning. We do have on the north side of this disturbance, we have a very long fetch of east winds primarily, fairly moderate, 15 to 30 knots in that stretch. And what that'll do is it'll generate some high seas and elevated tides along the coast. So not even directly related necessarily to the disturbance is this long fetch, and this is what's giving us our high seas and some minor coastal flooding, some high surf at the beach areas, and in the marine zones too, some higher seas, perhaps 4 to 5 feet building to 6 to 8 feet. So be aware of that. We're also, we have small craft advisories out for many of the waters for these higher winds and seas. And then don't want to leave out rip currents. If we do have any swimmers there at the beaches, this kind of wind flow pattern is conducive to rip currents, which can be very dangerous, of course. Here's a look at the marine hazards. As of this afternoon, we have issued a coastal flood advisory based on the factors I've just mentioned, and also a small craft advisory there you can see in more of a pink color. The coastal flood advisory is until 7 a.m. Sunday morning. I'll show you some of the tide gauge forecasts in a moment, and you'll see why that is. Minor coastal flooding, especially near times of high tides, and then that concern for strong rip currents at the beaches. And then for boaters, pretty modest southeasterly wind, 15 to 25 knots, gusts to 30 knots, seas up to 9 feet. Now, if the storm were to really get its act together over the next several hours, we could even conceivably see some higher gusts than that down near the center track, down near Matagorda Bay. But right now, we think this forecast should hold. Looking at tide levels, upper chart there, Galveston Bay entrance, a lot of lines there. Focus on the left-hand side, the red line. That's the observed water level over the past couple of days. And then right of that vertical line is the forecast water level. And there's some ranges given along the way to give you an idea of the uncertainty. But you can see at the bay entrance, even tonight, our high tides are going to be up around 4 feet, maybe a little bit higher or lower than that. And typically that will give us some minor coastal flooding on some of our roadways, out on Bolivar and some of the low areas on Galveston Island. And you see around high tide, those levels up around 4 feet continue really through Saturday night, maybe a bit of a drop off for a time, and then back Sunday morning, Sunday evening, we have another high tide pretty close to that. So we're looking at, at least 2 to 3 days of concern for minor coastal flooding around times of high tide. That also applies around Galveston Bay and down the coast. In fact, we have a gauge here for Freeport. You see much the same thing. Some values up around 3.5 feet, perhaps between 3.5 and 4 feet. So be aware of that. Finally, the main impacts, kind of a summary slide here, will be rainfall, some modest winds and wind gusts, and elevated tides and seas at the coast. Could see some street flooding, especially where we get locally heavy amounts, heavy downpours, kind of like we're seeing now in some areas, some moderate downpours at least, especially since the ground is fairly saturated. There'll be more runoff than there normally would. Elevated surf and tides at the beaches will likely lead to some minor coastal flooding around times of high tide, and so we do have a coastal flood advisory in effect. Some gusty winds, mainly in the 20 to 30 mile per hour range at the coast, but possibly up to tropical storm force if that storm were to really intensify in the next several hours. So that's probably a high bound there, that 40 mile per hour, mostly more in the 15 to 30 mile per hour range at the coast. Can't rule out an isolated brief tornado, but that's definitely a secondary threat as well. And as far as confidence, fairly high on the track at this point. The center looks to be tracking down near or a little south of Matagorda Bay. And we think the impacts from the system are pretty well, we're pretty confident about that. If the storm were to unexpectedly strengthen this evening, it's not out of the question. There could be some tropical storm tropical storm warnings issued for a brief period, but this is not expected at this time. And if that were to occur, it would really not signal a significant change to the forecast. So if you hear something to that effect, I would not be overly concerned. I think the impacts that we've briefed should still apply, even if it were to become a tropical depression or minimal tropical storm. And then just in the back of your mind, it would be good to keep an eye on the radar over the next day or two to see if we get any feeder bands off the Gulf on the backside. There are a few models hinting at this for Saturday. Right now, we're not overly concerned about that, but it is something that we'll need to keep an eye on.